Super Friends made an entire generation believe they knew Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. But the show you remember may never have actually existed the way you remember it. Because behind the Hall of Justice were strange stories that Saturday morning kids were never meant to know. Superheroes restricted in how they could fight, characters created for completely unexpected reasons, and things we consider symbols of Super Friends did not even appear when the show began in 1973. So how much did Super Friends really change? Today we are going to explore 20 weird facts about Super Friends. And stay until number 20, because if your first memory is the Hall of Justice, the Legion of Doom, or the Wonder Twins, there is one fact about the original version that you definitely need to hear. Before the trouble alert sounds, hit like and subscribe. Let's start with Number 1. Wendy, Marvin, and Wonder Dog were basically copies of Scooby-Doo. If you have ever wondered why two ordinary teenagers and a hound were allowed to hang around Superman, the reason is actually very simple. Scooby-Doo was making a ton of money at the time. In the early 70s, Hanna-Barbera had enormous success with Scooby-Doo. Where are you? And like every studio that finds a money-making formula, they thought, what if we did the same thing again? Just a little differently. This time, Batman would be there too. In fact, Hanna-Barbera had already tried that formula before Super Friends was created. In 1972, Batman and Robin appeared in 2 episodes of the new Scooby-Doo movies, and the idea proved that it could work. So when the studio landed the Justice League project, they continued with the model of young sidekicks and created Wendy, Marvin, and Wonder Dog. Looking at these 3 characters, the influence of Scooby-Doo is almost impossible to miss. Wendy is the smart one, Marvin is the clumsy guy who provides the laughs, and Wonder Dog is basically Scooby after all identifying features have been erased. He even speaks in that familiar kind of mumbled, broken, hard-to-understand English, while everyone around him treats it as a completely normal way for a dog to communicate. The connection becomes even more interesting when you learn that Wonder Dog was voiced by Frank Welker, who was also the voice of Fred in Scooby-Doo. But by 1977, audiences wanted more superheroes and fewer teenagers in sweaters solving mysteries. Wendy, Marvin, and Wonder Dog therefore quietly disappeared without the show even bothering to provide an explanation. The tie-in comic books did. According to them, all 3 left to go to college. And to be honest, that was probably one of the most realistic things that ever happened in Super Friends. Number 2, how Super Friends came back from the dead. The original 1973 show was canceled after just 1 season. 16 episodes aired from September to December, after which ABC continued showing reruns through the spring. On August 24, 1974, Super Friends officially disappeared from the schedule. By all indications, the story should have ended there. But then ABC's new Saturday morning shows failed to attract kids. The network needed something to fill the empty slot. In February 1976, they pulled Super Friends out of storage and reran the old 1973 episodes, this time cut into half-hour segments instead of the previous 1-hour format. And something no one expected happened. The reruns were more successful than expected. ABC suddenly found itself in a rather ironic situation. The show they had once canceled was now beating their new shows. At the same time, superheroes were booming on primetime television. Linda Carter's Wonder Woman was a major success, while the $6 Million Man was extremely popular. Kids who watched those shows at night also wanted superheroes on Saturday mornings. So ABC went back to Hanna-Barbera and ordered a new version of Super Friends. The result was the all-new Super Friends Hour in 1977, with more action and finally allowing the heroes to face real villains. If the 1976 reruns had failed, perhaps the later revivals would never have existed. The entire 12-year journey of Super Friends was brought back to life simply because ABC needed to fill a time slot and decided to give another chance to a show they had once abandoned. Number 3, Black Vulcan was created to avoid paying royalties. By the late 1970s, Super Friends began creating superheroes based on something rather unexpected: legal loopholes. Originally, Hanna-Barbera wanted to bring Black Lightning into the all-new Super Friends Hour in 1977. The character had just debuted in April of that year and was DC's first black superhero to have his own series. But the problem came down to royalties. Black Lightning's creator, Jenny Blake Isabella, previously known as Tony Isabella, had a rare contract at the time. Every time the character was used outside the comics, Isabella would receive a small royalty payment. Just a few cents per episode, but DC did not want that amount deducted from the licensing fee. DC told Hanna-Barbera that if they wanted to use Black Lightning, they would have to pay extra. Hanna-Barbera, known for being frugal, refused. The solution that followed was Black Vulcan. The same lightning powers, a similar appearance, but legally a completely different character. Even more ironically, Black Vulcan was designed by Alex Toth, the famous artist behind Space Ghost and Birdman, and Isabella did not even know what had happened. Isabella still thought Black Lightning was going to appear on the show. Then one Saturday morning in September 1977, Isabella turned on the TV and saw a completely new superhero with lightning powers standing in the Hall of Justice. Isabella later left DC, but before leaving, Isabella had one response left. In Black Lightning number 10, the other Black Lightning, Isabella created an imposter named Barbara Hanna, who pretended to be a superhero before being exposed by Black Lightning. Legally, it was a different superhero, but in reality, it was still the same lightning bolt. Number 4. The Hall of Justice is a real building in Ohio. For an entire generation of kids, the Hall of Justice seemed like the most important address on the planet. Superman received missions there. Batman pressed mysterious buttons. Aquaman occasionally showed up to remind everyone that he still worked there. And the place looked very real because, in a way, it actually existed. The headquarters of Super Friends was inspired by Cincinnati Union Terminal, a massive Art Deco train station in Ohio with sweeping curves and towering windows. Exactly the kind of building where you could imagine Superman flying straight through the front door. And the choice was not accidental. Hanna-Barbera was owned at the time by Taft Broadcasting, a company based in Cincinnati. So when background designer Al Muir needed to create a headquarters for the heroes in 1973, he drew inspiration from the city's prominent landmark. Joe Barbera and the network later continued to modify it, making it look more and more like Union Terminal, almost a direct copy. Muir did not like the final version. "Mine had more windows," he later told the Cincinnati Enquirer, but that design endured. Kids in the Midwest passing Union Terminal on family trips probably had to take a second look. The Hall of Justice seemed to be right in front of them, and more than 50 years later, the circle was complete. When Superman in 2025 needed the Hall of Justice, the production filmed at the very station that had originally inspired it. Number 5, the heroes were not allowed to punch anyone. Superman can lift entire continents, hear a heartbeat from orbit, and even reverse the rotation of the Earth. But there was one thing he could not do in Super Friends: throw a punch. By the early 1970s, parent groups had spent years continuously criticizing Saturday morning television for the level of violence in cartoons. So when Super Friends premiered in 1973, ABC's Standards and Practices Department laid down the rules from the beginning. No punching, no kicking, no hand-to-hand fighting of any kind. In other words, they were making a superhero show where the superheroes were not allowed to do the most basic thing a superhero does. So half of the villains were not really villains at all. They were often just scientists with weather machines that had gotten slightly out of control, or inventors who accidentally pointed a giant magnet in the wrong direction toward the ocean. Instead of rushing into a fight, the Super Friends usually had to talk to them and convince them to stop. Batman also had to trade his cape and fist for a utility belt filled with bat-themed solutions. Trapped in a trap? Bat laser. Villain getting away? Batnet. The plot suddenly slowing down right before the commercial break? Probably time for something else involving a bat. And the funniest part is that when Hawkman finally joined the lineup a few seasons later, he showed up carrying an extremely intimidating mace, but was never actually allowed to swing it. Number 6. Super Friends ruined Aquaman's reputation for 40 years. Before Jason Momoa showed up shirtless and covered in tattoos, Aquaman was once seen as a joke. And if you had to find the show that contributed the most to creating that image, it was Super Friends. In the comics, Aquaman was originally not a comic relief character at all. He debuted in 1941, and throughout the 40s and 50s, he fought Nazi U-boat commanders, modern-day pirates, and all kinds of criminals at sea. Basically, he was like the Coast Guard of Atlantis, and nobody thought that was funny. Then Saturday morning, television came along. Super Friends placed Aquaman in the Hall of Justice next to Superman, who could fly into the sun and come back stronger, and Batman, who always seemed to have something in his utility belt to solve every problem. And standing between them was a guy dressed in orange and green, whose most famous ability was talking to fish. The problem was that the writers almost never knew what to do with Aquaman on land, and unfortunately, most of the show took place there. So every few episodes, an underwater crisis would appear, so Aquaman could finally get a chance to do what he did best. Once it was handled, he would swim back to the Hall of Justice and continue standing there waiting for the next time. That image followed Aquaman for decades. Family Guy once had him ask a fish to go get him a beer. Robot Chicken turned his uselessness into an entire series of jokes. By 2005, HBO's Entourage even devoted an entire season to Vincent Chase, starring in a fictional Aquaman movie. The reason was pretty simple. Entourage creator Doug Ellin later admitted that Aquaman was the most ridiculous superhero he could think of. DC spent years trying to change that image. In the 90s, Aquaman was given long hair and a beard. He lost a hand in battle and replaced it with a harpoon hook. And eventually, DC cast Jason Momoa in the role as part of a billion-dollar movie franchise. But for an entire generation that grew up with Super Friends, it was already too late. The image of Aquaman standing in the Hall of Justice waiting for some underwater trouble had long been burned into their memories. Number 7. Meanwhile, at the Hall of Justice came from a news anchor on a sitcom. If you grew up with Saturday morning cartoons, just hearing this one line is enough to take you back to the days of shag carpeting. Meanwhile, at the Hall of Justice. That booming narration became one of the most iconic catchphrases in cartoon history, and the man who delivered it in the 1973 episodes was Ted Baxter. Well, technically, Ted Knight. But any adult watching at the time would have recognized him immediately. The clueless but extremely confident news anchor on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, who seemed unable to finish a newscast without mispronouncing someone's name. But in Super Friends, that very same voice carried the weight of an approaching apocalypse. A villain could be rambling on about his weather machine, then Ted Knight would suddenly thunder, "Meanwhile, at the Hall of Justice," making Batman checking a monitor sound as if the fate of all humanity depended on it. By 1977, Bill Woodson took over the role and brought his own variation, later at the Hall of Justice. But the formula remained perfect. The dramatic pauses, the booming voice, and the way every scene transition was presented as if America had just gone to DEFCON 1. Number 8. The Hall of Doom looks suspiciously familiar. By 1978, almost every kid watching Saturday morning television had the same reaction. Wait, is that? When Challenge of the Super Friends introduced the Legion of Doom's headquarters in the middle of the swamp, it was hard to ignore the resemblance to the helmet of a certain Dark Lord. A massive black dome, an angular, mechanical face rising out of the mud, and a look intimidating enough to make any superhero cautious. DC's official explanation is that the Hall of Doom was modeled after Black Manta's helmet, but most kids in 1978 saw something completely different, and they certainly were not thinking about Black Manta. Star Wars had been released in theaters just 1 year earlier and sent all of Hollywood into a frenzy. Suddenly, every cartoon and feature film wanted a little bit of that energy from a galaxy far, far away. The Hall of Doom could even fly, tunnel underground, and travel through time. Compared with the atmosphere of the Hall of Justice, which felt like a polite government building, this place really looked as if something bad could happen at any moment. The Legion of Doom looked less like a criminal organization and more like a Sith Lord who had decided to start a homeowners association. And its location? Slaughter Swamp, a name that DC Comics had used since 1944. It was the swampy area outside Gotham where, according to comic book legend, a wealthy merchant named Cyrus Gold was murdered in the 1890s, then about 50 years later crawled out of the mud with a new identity, Solomon Grundy. When you were designing the lair for 13 supervillains, clearly subtlety was never on the list of priorities. Let's pause for a moment. If you could choose only one member of Super Friends to save you, who would you choose? Leave your answer below and don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Alright, let's get back to the list. Number 9. Wonder Woman actually could not fly in Super Friends. In the comics of the 1970s, Wonder Woman actually could not fly. And surprisingly, that was true for more than the first 40 years of the character's history. She could glide on air currents for short distances, but she could not fly freely like Superman. It was not until George Perez rebooted Wonder Woman in 1987 that the ability officially became part of her superpowers. And of course, this created a pretty obvious problem for Super Friends. Everyone else had their own way of getting around. Superman goes without saying. Batman had the Batplane. Aquaman could at least swim at an impressive speed. But Wonder Woman? She needed a vehicle to keep up with the team. The solution was taken straight from the comics. The invisible jet, a completely transparent airplane. But Wonder Woman, sitting inside, was still clearly visible. So every time she took off, she looked like she was sitting in the middle of the sky, both hands gripping a steering wheel made of nothing while clouds drifted around her. The image was so strange that DC Comics later even tried to explain it differently. Some stories in 1981 claimed that in Wonder Woman's world, both the plane and its pilot were actually invisible. Readers could see her only because the artist drew her that way to make the story easier to understand. Yeah, let's just say that explanation makes sense. Because by then, kids watching Super Friends had already spent 8 years watching Wonder Woman fly around as if she were controlling something only she could see. Even the live-action Wonder Woman series with Linda Carter limited its use of the invisible jet, according to what has been reported, simply because it looked too ridiculous on screen. But Super Friends did not care. The invisible jet kept appearing again and again. Number 10. The original Super Friends did not fight any villains. We already know that Super Friends in 1973 was barely allowed to have any violence and eventually became so boring that ABC had to cancel it. But you have to look at what the Justice League actually faced in those first 16 episodes to see just how strange this season was. There were no supervillains, not a single one. No Joker, Lex Luthor, Brainiac, or Riddler. Instead, Earth's most powerful superhero team spent the entire season dealing with a heat wave caused by homesick aliens. A scientist who wanted to mine a golden meteor with giant metal U-shapes, a family of aliens from Balloonia who could inflate themselves, eco-terrorists, and a man who wanted to shrink every adult on Earth down to 2 inches to solve overpopulation. Then there were aliens stealing silicon from the ocean, a weather-controlling machine, and a scientist who wanted to split a planet in half and pull one piece back to become Earth's second moon. And most memorably of all, a country family fighting over a green rock that eventually turned out to be kryptonite. The Justice League of America did not really fight evil. They were more like they were running a Saturday morning intervention program for geniuses who had gone down the wrong path. Almost every episode ended with the same formula. The team cornered their opponent, explained why their plan was harmful, and then the person causing the trouble sincerely apologized. They shook hands, promised to change, and everything was resolved through conversation. Dr. Pelagian eventually got the polluting industrialists to agree to clean up the damage. The balloon people became friends and then returned home. And the scientist who wanted to split a planet in half was convinced to abandon his plan after hearing the story of Superman's origin. Throughout 16 episodes, the Justice League faced weather, scientists, and aliens, then mostly convinced them to change their minds. The result was like a 1-hour morality seminar, except everyone was wearing capes. Number 11. Casey Kasem voiced both Robin and Shaggy at the same time. In the 70s and 80s, Casey Kasem's voice seemed to be almost everywhere, even if you did not know who the man behind that voice was. He was on TV, on the radio, and somehow was also part of 2 completely different crime-fighting teams. For more than a decade, Kasem lived one of the strangest double lives in cartoon history. On one side of Saturday morning television, he was Shaggy, Scooby-Doo's always hungry, terrified companion who just wanted to stay away from trouble.
There's a character that I play on that show, the sidekick of Scooby-Doo for the past 17 or 18 years, and his name is Shaggy.
On the other side, he was Robin, the boy wonder, fighting alongside Batman and always ready to rush straight into danger. The same voice, but two almost completely opposite characters. And while playing both roles, Kasem was also hosting America's Top 40. A Gen X kid could be listening to him on the radio, then 10 minutes later turn on the TV and hear that same familiar voice shout, "That's right, Batman." Number 12, Super Friends was almost called Justice League of America. One of the most important changes to Super Friends actually happened before audiences even saw the first episode. Because originally the name Super Friends did not even exist. Hanna-Barbera planned to use the name of the DC comic book that the show was based on, Justice League of America. But by 1973, ABC saw a problem with that name. America was still in the Vietnam War era, and television networks had become more cautious about things that sounded too openly patriotic, especially since the show was also planned for international distribution. To them, Justice League of America sounded almost like the name of a superhero team operating under the sponsorship of the United States government. The solution was very simple. Get rid of it. Justice League disappeared. America did too. And that was how Super Friends was born, a name that did not sound much like the most powerful superhero force on the planet, but more like an extremely friendly after-school club. That was also quite fitting for the early episodes. Instead of constantly facing dangerous supervillains, audiences got lessons about pollution, giant computers, and a dog that looked as if he had accidentally run over from the Scooby-Doo set. It was not until 1978 that Challenge of the Super Friends began to move away from that overly gentle image. The opening even brought back the name Justice League of America. After years of being friendly Super Friends, the show finally remembered something rather important. These were superheroes, and they were supposed to be facing supervillains. Number 13, when Adam West reclaimed the cape. By 1984, Super Friends had been on the air for 11 years and had gone through 5 different versions. New title, new format, new toys, new theme music. The 1973 show had now changed a great deal, and that was when Hanna-Barbera made a surprising casting decision. Bring Adam West back as Batman. By then, West had spent nearly 2 decades trapped by the image of the original Batman, so heavily typecast that he had to appear at local fairs and rodeos in the Batman costume, alongside some voice acting work. West once said that producers would consider him for serious roles, but then back away because they were afraid audiences would only see Batman. DC Comics was not enthusiastic about the choice either. They had spent years trying to move away from the humorous, exaggerated image of Batman, and West was the face of that era. The production team had to repeatedly assure them that this time West would play Batman seriously, and they kept their word. In the Superpowers team, Galactic Guardians, the episode The Fear brought Batman's origin story to the screen outside the comics for the first time. The script was written by Alan Burnett, who later became a producer on Batman, the animated series. Scarecrow forces Batman to return to Crime Alley, where his parents had been murdered, and West performs the scene with real pain, fear, and weight. The humorous Batman of the 60s was gone. There was only a man facing the worst night of his life. The timing was almost a strange coincidence. Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns appeared in 1986. Tim Burton's Batman was released in theaters in 1989. By the end of the decade, Batman had become a dark and brooding character, and popular culture gradually came to see that as the image Batman had always had. Number 14, the Wonder Twins were basically Donnie and Marie from outer space. By 1977, Super Friends returned to ABC's Saturday morning schedule with a new name, the all-new Super Friends Hour, and Hanna-Barbera decided that the show also needed a completely new source of energy. Their solution was so deeply 1970s that it would be hard for any idea from a network meeting to top it. What if Donnie and Marie Osmond were aliens with superpowers? Basically, that is exactly how the Wonder Twins were created. In the mid-70s, the Osmonds were everywhere, from magazine covers and lunchboxes to their own weekly variety show on ABC. Hanna-Barbera took the wholesome image of the brother and sister, added a few superpowers, and that was it. During development, the two characters were originally called Dick and Jane, while their pet was Mighty Monkey. But then someone must have realized that Dick and Jane Fight Crime sounded more like a reading book than a superhero show, so they became Zan and Jaina, with names inspired directly by Tarzan and Jane. The pointed ears came from somewhere else. Hanna-Barbera animator Daryl McNeil later confirmed that they were directly inspired by Spock. Star Trek was extremely popular at the time, and it seemed that every studio wanted a little bit of its influence. What is even more interesting is that the Wonder Twins were originally much more powerful. Early drafts gave Zan the ability to stretch his body like Plastic Man, while Jaina could transform into almost anything. The problem was that the writers seemed to have accidentally created two characters so powerful that they made Superman unnecessary. So their powers were quickly reduced. Zan could now only turn into water, opening the door to decades of jokes about every kind of strange liquid form the writers could think of. A bucket of water held by the space monkey, a localized snowstorm, an ice cage, and most memorably, one time he even turned into a jet engine made of ice that actually worked. It seemed that the more interesting missions were all saved for Jaina, and the phrase Wonder Twin powers activate became a playground catchphrase almost immediately. Number 15, the voices of Super Friends were inherited from Filmation. Before Hanna-Barbera took over the DC characters, the animation rights had been in the hands of a smaller studio called Filmation. From 1966 to 1969, the studio produced a series of DC superhero shows for CBS, such as The New Adventures of Superman, The Superman Aquaman Hour of Adventure, and The Batman Superman Hour. They were quite popular on Saturday mornings, but were quickly forgotten. When Hanna-Barbera obtained the DC license in 1973 and began making Super Friends, they did not rebuild the entire voice cast. Instead, many familiar voices from Filmation were kept. Olin Soul had voiced Batman since 1968. His soft, thin, slightly nasal voice sounded nothing like the image of a dark hero. But Hanna-Barbera continued to use him. Soul remained Batman until 1983 for a total of more than 15 years across two studios. Casey Kasem also returned as Robin, while Ted Knight took on the role of narrator. Vic Perrin, who had voiced Hawkman in Filmation's Aquaman series, later became the voice of Sinestro in Super Friends. The biggest change was Aquaman. Filmation had used Marvin Miller, but Hanna-Barbera switched to Norman Alden. And to this day, there still seems to be no clear explanation why. Wonder Twin powers deactivate. So we have just explored 20 weird facts about Super Friends, and perhaps the Hall of Justice in our memories is not exactly the same as what actually appeared on screen. But now I want to hear from you. Do you remember the first time you watched Super Friends? And what about the show has stayed with you the most to this day? Leave your answer in the comments. If you still remember those Saturday mornings with Super Friends, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to keep joining us as we return to the shows that shaped the childhood of an entire generation. Thank you for joining us at the Hall of Justice today. Wishing you good health, lots of happiness, and we will see you again in the next video. Wonder Twin powers deactivate.